Welcome back everybody to our studies in medieval philosophy. This lesson is going to be focusing on the concept of original sin as elucidated by St. Augustine. Now, as I mentioned in previous lessons, this has been a series of videos talking firstly about the writings and some of the important works that had been selected by St. Augustine of Hippo, before starting to look at some of the key philosophical principles and philosophical ideas that can be elucidated by St. Augustine himself. What is arguably the case is that the concept of original sin is one of the most fundamental concepts of Augustinian philosophy and Augustinian theology. Now, we will look in more detail at the philosophical and theological implications of the doctrine of original sin, specifically talking about how this is informed by various different pieces of Christian doctrine, the ways in which Augustine himself talks about this and elucidates this idea, and then we will talk finally about another topic within the broader corpus of Augustinian philosophy afterwards. So before we talk about how Augustine conceptualizes original sin, let's begin by thinking about what actually is the doctrine of original sin. It's one of the most important doctrines within Christian theology, at least, and it is one that essentially derives the principle that human beings, by virtue of their birth into this world, are born with sin. Now, every human being is born with an inherent nature to conduct and to perform sinful actions. And what happens and what is required is that people need to be cleansed, and that the cleansing of people is something which is to be achieved through Christian practice, the Christian sacrament of baptism. Now, while having its origins in various different scriptural passages, at least in terms of basic references to the idea of original sin, and even some of the early Greek and Latin church fathers, it was in fact Augustine who formulated fully the principles, which then causes them to be incorporated into the doctrines with the Council of Carthage and the Council of Orange in 411 to 418 AD and 429 AD, respectively. So one of the things that we are not going to get into, of course, because this is a history of medieval philosophy, I want to, if you go over and have a look at the Theology Academy, we're constructing a number of lessons on the history of Christianity. But one of the things that is very interesting with the history of Christianity specifically is the ways in which we see the doctrines of grace, the doctrines of original sin, all of these other different kinds of things, the idea of the Trinity, the idea of monotheism versus polytheism, essentially a lot of these ideas being quite heavily in flux prior to, or at least in this very, very early embryonic period of Christian theology and theological interpretations, such that the writings of early Greek fathers and Latin church fathers as well actually had significant influence into the ways in which these principles and doctrines were incorporated into the broader corpus of Christian theology. And you obviously have a number of different councils that go about incorporating these ideas. So the doctrines of original sin incorporated with the Council of Carthage and the Council of Orange, but you also have things like Trinitarianism being incorporated with things like the Nicene Creed and the Council of Nicaea as well, all of which are very, very, very important, but shows the sort of nature of early Christian practice and early Christian theology being very much in flux for a lot of the time, with things like Marcionism and Gnosticism, general heresy versus orthodoxy in terms of the Christian Church, and then eventually in I believe 1157 you start to see the schism of the Catholic Church in the West, the Roman See or the Holy See versus the Eastern Orthodox Church in Byzantium with the Byzantine Empire and the Constantinople See. The Great Schism, as it is sometimes referred to. So all of this is obviously history of Christianity and not the topic of this lesson. So let's move on to talking about original sin. Now, fundamentally, the biblical grounding for the principle of original sin is of course, the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. Because according to Augustine specifically, when Adam sinned, there was a transformation in human nature, the nature of which is transmitted throughout humanity through sexual reproduction. So the concept of sin is almost like an acquired characteristic or a biological or genetic characteristic which is passed on through the lineage of succession of people who were born after Adam and Eve. Of course, obviously, Augustine doesn't talk about genetic successions and all this kind of thing because, of course, this is writing before biology has any kind of semblance of actual scientific prowess. But at least that's the sort of conceptualization that Augustine thinks about. Augustine believes that when Adam sinned, he transformed humanity into the mass of the condemned, the massa damnata. And so this is obviously something which is very, very considerable when it comes to the ways not only that sin operates, but the ways that the original sin, the first sin in the Garden of Eden, actually was elucidated. Augustine takes the view that when Adam does this sinning, it represents an act which was twofold in nature. On the one hand, you have the fact that we see an act of foolishness in the sinning of Adam. And then on the other hand, it was an act of pride and disobedience to God. Two things which, of course, are not necessarily mutually exclusive in the sense, because what this did was coming about as the result of Satan sowing the seeds of evil within Adam and Eve, specifically within Adam's sin, in specifically itself. Now, this is a concept here, concupiscence, which is a word that I very much cannot pronounce ever, which is a theological idea that we can sort of tie into this basic theories when we look at Augustinian theology and Augustinian philosophy. It's a basic idea that humans have an inherent tendency to sin, and the word itself literally refers to some kind of longing, described in terms of sensual and physical desire. And what Augustine believed in relation to this is that it was this concept that causes the descendants of Adam and Eve to now live in sin. Aquinas would later elucidate this principle in more detail, and we will get to Aquinas and this kind the idea of Thomas Aquinas' philosophy in future lessons time when we start to look at the later period of the medieval philosophy. But noting what Aquinas says here is that it is less the concept of sexual lust or desire, but rather something known as libido habitualis, the idea of a wound in human nature specifically. And it is this concept which is really carried on throughout a number of, and throughout a lot of Christian doctrine and Christian practice, such that the sacrament of baptism is almost a response to the concept of original sin, despite, of course, predating original sin with Jesus famously being baptized in the River Jordan, but still fundamentally being something that is of paramount importance when it comes to the development of Christian doctrine. Like always, feel free to like and subscribe if you want to see more of these lessons. The two citations of paramount importance here are, of course, the Cambridge Companion to Medieval Philosophy, as well as Anthony Kenny's Medieval Philosophy textbook, or his History of Western Philosophy, which sort of encapsulates and puts all these puts all of the books that he writes together into one. The next lesson we'll talk about the concept of the problem of evil, another very, very important theological and philosophical concept that is tackled by and discussed by St. Augustine as well.